Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sport Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to speak to Dr. Karen Howells and Holly Bradshaw. Hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hi.
Good to have you both on. Why don't we start by getting you both to introduce yourself to the Sport Psych Show audience. Karen, why don't we go with you first?
Hi, and thank you for asking me, Dan. So I'm Karen Howells. I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I am also an applied sports psychology practitioner. My main research areas are to do with two areas. The first is adversarial growth, and the second is something we call the post-Olympic blues.
And post-Olympic blues is what we're here predominantly to talk about today. Holly, welcome to the show. Introduce yourself. Most people will know you, but introduce away.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Holly Bradshaw, British record holder in the pole vault and recent Olympic bronze medalist at Tokyo. I'm also a Sport Psychology MSc student and very, very lucky to have co-authored the Post-Olympic Blues piece of research with Karen and someone else. Very lucky to have that to my name as well.
Well, that's the research piece we're going to focus on today. Holly, I didn't know you were studying sports psychology, a master's in sports psychology. What drew you to sports psychology in the first place?
So for me, I was always really negative, not really negative about sports psychology, but I was just one of those kids where I was like, oh, I don't need that. I'm fine. Like, I'm mentally tough. What do I need that for? And I'd had a couple of, not negative experiences, but a couple of very generic consultations with some sports psychologists, which had put me off a little bit. And I got injured back in 2013 and I went to a place called Bisham Abbey, which is a big rehab centre where all the sports people go. I spent 2 weeks there and worked with a sports psychologist, Sarah Cecil, and was like blown away with her methods. We created a really good relationship and she's been my sports psychologist ever since. And throughout those 7 years of working with her, I grew a massive passion for sports psychology. I saw how much it helped, was really just intrigued for this discipline. And I thought, I've finished my undergrad in sport and exercise science and thought, I love studying. I want to carry on. Let's do an MSc in sports psychology. And I've absolutely loved it. I'm really lucky to study at Loughborough University, which is where I also train. And I've finished everything apart from my DIS, which is what I'm currently working on.
Coming over to you, Karen, just fascinating, Holly, and kind of mirrors my sporting background a little bit, although you're a far more successful sports person than I have ever been. But I was a professional golfer and had, as you kind of described, some not negative experiences, but some generic experiences. But still out of it, I started to understand sports psychology a little bit more and really eventually became passionate about it to the point of becoming a sports psychologist. And coming over to you there, Karen, I mean, that's fascinating. Such a transition from Holly there in terms of her attitude towards or perception of sports psychology. And do you think that's a big part of our role as sports psychologists is to help people, to help players, athletes understand what we do and to see our role more as multi-dimensional rather than this unidimensional notion of mental toughness or mental strength?
It's one of the very interesting things, I think. I know we're going to talk in a little bit more depth later about the paper, but one of the things that I've had to reflect on, I suppose over the years, but particularly with this paper, is the perception of sports psychology in both the wider population and amongst athletes. And in my applied practice, I've quite often come across, as I'm sure many sports psychologists have, the perception of I'm only coming to you because I've got a problem, or I don't want the coach to know because they may think that I'm not as, to use the expression that Holly's just used there, I'm not as mentally tough as I should be. And certainly when I was going through my stage 2 qualification sport and exercise psychology qualification, there were a couple of people early on who objected to me talking to certain athletes on the basis of, you're kind of demonstrating they've got problems. And there was this image of sports psychologists as only working with people who had problems. So I've always been aware of that. And it's one of the things that I have tried to overturn with the clients that I've worked with, that it's if you can see working with a sports psychologist as a little bit more about performance enhancement or improvement in well-being, rather than starting from a very low point, negative point, that everybody can benefit from, whether it's the skills or the strategies that perhaps we can educate and instruct in. But what I found, I'm going to go as far as to say disappointing in terms of our profession, is the view that many athletes still have about sports psychologists. And I think that came out very clearly in what some of the Olympians were saying. And it was about trust and respect and not really considering that the sports psychologists really understood, really were able to empathise. And I think it's a very fair point. And I think it's something that as a profession we need to address. It's very easy when you've got a professional qualification to consider yourself the expert. And quite often we get into that kind of power relationship with the people that we work with, unintentionally, I would say. But yeah, I think sports psychologists, and certainly I'm going to take this on board with my future practice, is to try and promote a different message about what we can do and what we're able to do. And we're not able to wave that magic wand and make everything better. But I think we need to reflect on the way that we work with athletes, the way we work with coaches, rather than being very qualification-led, which is what we are. And I know that that's very important. But yeah, I think there are some changes that maybe I will be making as a consequence of reflecting on this particular study.
I think jump in. I think what you said there was really good, and like promoting the discipline of sports psychology is not fixing problems, as there is actually so many more things that we offer. You know, all the way through lockdown, I would have fortnightly calls with my sports psychologist, and she would take me through a visualization session of me. She would talk me, you're walking into the high pack, you pick up your pole. We went through this whole process, and you know, I'm not dealing with a problem. I've not got a mental blank, or I'm really unconfident. This is just a really formalized visualization session, which was really productive. And that's how I work with my sports psychologist now. And it's taken years to build this rapport. And of course, when I started out with her, it was, I'm injured, I'm upset, how do I change these negative thoughts? Whereas now we're working on another project, which is I want to change I said to her, I need to change my thought processes to, I need to do, you know, this isn't going to make sense, but kick my leg every time in the jump. And I can do it, but my mind is stopping me. What can we do? And she was like, right, well, I'm going to come up with some stuff. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. We'll do some trackside work. And it's like problem solving together. I think the discipline has so much more to offer.
I think that's fascinating. And as you were speaking there, Holly, it was making me think, I mean, having been an athlete, looking to be a sports psychologist, would you say that your experiences suggest that we in sports psychology need to differentiate? Clearly, performance and well-being are linked. We know that, of course they are. Nobody denies that. But do you think we almost have to differentiate those two disciplines, performance psychology and welfare, well-being and mental health, so that people understand that we can work from a well-being and welfare and mental health perspective, but we can also work from a performance. We can help somebody stretch where stretches and not just shrinks, essentially, as I heard somebody say once, which I quite like. Do we have to be more explicit, not just in terms of what we do, but differentiate between progressing with our performance and thriving and flourishing with our well-being?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's why there has been a stigma, and there still is a stigma. You see an athlete at the track talking to a sports psychologist and immediately go, ooh, what's the problem there? Well, actually, what if she's just like, I want to be better. What areas am I lacking? I'm going to speak to a sports psychologist because I'm as strong as I can be. I'm as fast as I can be. I'm eating as clean as I can be. What are the gaps? And sports psychology is one of those areas that can improve performance massively. We need to eradicate you're going to have sports psychology because you're mentally weak, or this, that, and the other. It can be used just as effectively to enhance performance.
I think there's potentially an opportunity for culture change, but I think it needs to come in the sporting organisations from the top. And I started off my my sports psychology career at Loughborough as well, and worked with one of the swimming coaches there, Ian Armiger, who has a fantastic reputation as a swimming coach. And he had a very, I think at the time, very progressive attitude to sports psychology. And he, for anyone who knows him, he was full of life, very bubbly, bounced around the poolside, silly o'clock in the morning, probably on caffeine. But he used to say, a happy swimmer is a fast swimmer. Karen, make my swimmers happy. And I think that really kind of resonated with this well-being and performance, that they're not separate all of the time. Yeah. Sometimes they are, but they're not separate all the time. And that if we can work with athletes to improve their well-being, that impacts on performance. And obviously it impacts on other areas of their life as well. But changing that shrink image of sports psychologists, I think is absolutely vital. And I think moving away from just focusing on performance, which traditionally or typically is where sports psychologists have worked in, that actually working on well-being and mental health indirectly impacts on performance.
Absolutely, well said. Your story of the swimming coach there reminded me of something that Brendan Rodgers once said, the Leicester City football manager, that he imagines every player has an invisible tattoo on their forehead saying, "Help me feel great. Help me feel great." Mm-hmm. And as a coach, it's important to attune to that, I suppose. We will make our way around to the piece, and we've kind of briefly connected with the research piece over the last few minutes, but it would be remiss of me. I mean, one thing I would say, just in passing here, Holly, you mentioned, and in passing, in accordance with what I think the robustness of sports psychology and being a sports psychologist can entail, because you mentioned there, Holly, that you would be speaking fortnightly with your sports psychologist over Zoom, and she would be taking you through a visualization script. But then you also referred to the sports psychologist being out on the track with you, in the arena while you're practicing, working on some specific motor behavior that you're trying to improve upon. And it just demonstrates, no question here, but it just demonstrates how robust what we do is. We can do it on Zoom. We can do it, on the track, can't we, with individuals, with athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really diverse. And I would, for the last however many years, I would meet up with my sports psychologist in person once a month, but with COVID, we've been doing it virtual, which at first I was like, it's not the same, it's going to be rubbish, but it actually has been really good. And yeah, I think whether it's in person, Zoom, trackside, they're all really important kind of communication sessions that we have, and each is beneficial as the other. And I think just the diversity that sports psychologists can work in is, it's worth celebrating and highlighting.
It would be remiss of me in this Olympic year. We're going to be talking about the Olympics, the post-Olympic blues. And Holly, you kindly gave me permission to ask you a few questions around your bronze medal winning competition in the summer in Tokyo. I'm going to try not geek out here, and we will get onto the research paper. But I think an event like I was watching, and I really enjoyed it, and you were incredible. And I think having been a golfer, whereby you know that it's not that challenges are coming thick and fast. It's just there's plenty of time to think. And one of the things I've always thought about the challenges, the psychological challenges, the challenge of the pole vault alongside, say, the long jump, the high jump, is there seems like there's quite a lot of time to think. But I'd love to know what were your specific challenges during your final rounds there in Tokyo?
Yeah, it was actually a really challenging competition. Okay. We have a qualification round, which is 2 days before the final, and there's like 32 athletes, and we narrow it down to 12. And it's a really, really stressful competition. You're not going in there to perform to your best. For me, it's a subpar jump that I have to perform to qualify, but for some reason brings on the just nerves that I've never experienced. There's just so much to lose and nothing to gain, and there's just so much anxiety around it. And I remember out in Tokyo, both the qualification and the final were so stressful, super anxiety provoking, and really challenging competitions for different reasons. And I was just super calm and relaxed the whole time. And I look back on it and I think, how was I that relaxed? In qualification, we had torrential rain and I mean there was 2 inches of standing water on the track. We had to break for 1 hour and 40, and the competition resumed after 4 hours I'd been out there. So goodness knows what was going on in my head, but I managed to just deliver one jump to qualify myself for the final. And people ask me, how were you so calm? And I don't know, but I know exactly what it was. It's years and years and years of mental training, preparation. It's easier for an athlete to do a one-off performance. But for me, I've been consistently in the top 5 in the world at every major champs for the last 9 years. And that, for me, every experience has been building on my psychological resilience. So for me, it was easy to be out there and be calm. There were people running around like headless chickens trying to get out the rain, and I was just able to be calm. And it was the same in the final. We had a horrible headwind, which is why the results are a bit weird. 450 came 5th in the Olympic final, which, that hasn't happened in any major championship for the last 10 years. So we had a really horrible headwind for the first half. And I remember sitting there after I'd cleared 470, and I was in the silver medal position, and nobody else apart from me in the gold medal position person had cleared it. And my head was going, am I going to win a silver medal of just jumping 470? So I thought, no, I can't. I've been caught in this trap before. I found myself going, okay, that's 1 more gone. Okay, that's 2 gone, 3 gone. I was like, no, I've done this before and I'm not doing it again. So off I went to the toilet. Once I come back, 4 of us were left in the comp. So it's a good job I did that. Otherwise, my head would just have been gone and I wouldn't have been able to clear the next bar. And that, again, is just through experience. And I always try and tell younger athletes, you can't rush the process. You have to build on these experiences. You have to build these kind of moments throughout your career, and then they'll accumulate at one point, and then that's when you'll be successful. And the way you're successful is through being consistent.
3 things I heard there were drawing from experience, talking to yourself when you needed to, and taking charge of your behaviour rather than, as you mentioned, say running around like a headless chicken. Or it was a case of slow down and stick to my normal behaviours, my process. Those were the 3 things I heard. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Could I add something there?
Please.
Because we were working on this research project together, obviously Holly and I were talking prior to her going to Tokyo. And one of the things that stuck with me from one of the research sessions that we were having, we were talking, inevitably, we talked a little bit about Holly going to Tokyo. And she made it very clear that her goal was to go there and enjoy it. And I was so impressed at that point that here was somebody going to the Olympics who had a a real potential to come back with a medal. But there was no, I want to win. There was no, I want a PB. It was, I'm going there. I want to enjoy it, and I want to do my best. And to hear an elite athlete at Holly's level say that, I think is inspirational, because I'd love to hear 12 and 13-year-olds say, I just want to go and enjoy myself, let alone an Olympic athlete. So although Holly hasn't said that in what she's just spoken about, it was one of the things that really stuck with me, kind of watching Holly compete in Tokyo was, I wonder if she's enjoying it.
I think that's one of the things me and my sports psychologist learn a lot over the last 7-8 years is there was a point in my career where I hated the sport. There was so much pressure on my shoulders. I was beating myself up. I had to live up to expectations, not just of myself, but everyone else. And I really had to ask myself, why did I pick up that pole on that very first session? Why did I go back the next day? And it was so simple. I loved it. So then why have I gotten so far away from this? There's sponsors and there's opportunities, but why do I not love this when I did from the very first day? And I really had to get back to the psychology of, I love this. And now I've just been performing so much better ever since. I'm very, very process driven. So it's all about, what am I doing on the runway? Am I tall at takeoff? Am I kicking my leg? It's not, well, there's the bar, I want to clear it. And for me, that just wipes out all anxiety. It gives me confidence. I'm not nervous. I can enjoy myself. And it's almost like relishing the challenge of, okay, it's raining. Well, I've brought 2 umbrellas because one is not enough because I need a backup. I've got 50 towels, even though I didn't even think it was going to rain. I've got 50 towels. No one else has. And it's all just, I relish the challenge and I just love it and I enjoy it. And my sports psychologist, it always reminds me, you want to be here, so why aren't you enjoying yourself? If you don't want to be here, you wouldn't, and you want to put yourself in this anxiety provoking situation and battle it out. That's what you love. And I think that's that just means that I can go into the most stressful competition of my life, like the Olympics, and be like, I'm here to enjoy myself and I'm going to deliver as best as I can. And if that's good enough for a medal, then fine. If it's not, then I'm also fine with that, because I'm here just to enjoy it.
I love that, and I'm going to try and not go down a rabbit hole because I do want to talk about this research paper. But all of this, listening to both of you speak, in my own consultancy practice, I find if we look at this under the rubric of achievement motivation, and I suppose specifically goal achievement theory, Karen, as you said, rather than outcome and high performance, more the process or the enjoyment factor. And it always amazes me every day of my life how I can speak to elite athletes about this subject and find that the intrinsic tends to always overpower the extrinsic. And that almost like when the penny drops for them, that they can give themselves permission to go back to the intrinsic and say, well, I started this because I loved it. Let's do this like I'm doing this like a kid again, essentially, to enjoy this. And it almost feels like 2 strands here as well. It's the enjoyment factor and it's the task focus, the process focus, and bringing those together. And that's a powerful cocktail to be able to focus on. I love this, and I'm going to focus on those little tasks on the runway. It's that dual focus that really sort of grips you, I suppose. No question.
Yeah, well, I can't control whether I knock the bar off or not, and I can't control whether I win. What I can control is how disciplined am I on the run, how tall I am at takeoff, and how fast I kick my leg. Those are things that I can control. So why am I not focusing on them? Because they give me the best chance of clearing the bar and winning. So for me, it's just a no-brainer. When I'm in the gym, do I want to clean a PB? Of course I do, but what I need to do to get there is, keep the bar close, get my elbows under, and every single movement pattern, every single thing that I do in training or competition is process driven, because that's the only way I can control it.
Absolutely. Now, a mere 25 minutes into the show, we'll move on to what we're here to talk about. I could talk about that all day. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. But you've joined forces to write a research paper entitled "Abandoned to Manage the Post-Olympic Blues: Olympians reflect on their experiences and the need for change." And I just thought this was absolutely fascinating for so many reasons. And what I would actually say, sort of speaking to the audience here, is that even if you don't coach or participate or are involved in Olympic sports, I think where I think there's so much value in this paper over and above what, who you're specifically speaking to, and that's Olympic sports, is that to me this speaks to all sports. It speaks to participant voices across all sports. So I just think it's absolutely fascinating. But let's explore it a little bit. Let's come to you first, Karen. Where did this research paper come from? How did you two join forces? Why don't you give us a bit of a background here?
Well, there's a little bit of a history with this. I suppose it was when I came out of my PhD. I'd been very much focused on adversarial growth, so the positives that come out of adversities. So I was very clear about one of my main interests, which was things going wrong. And my PhD was looking at Olympic swimmers. So I had developed an interest in things going wrong, adversities, predominantly in Olympic sport. And although adversarial growth, post-traumatic growth is still one of my research areas, coming out of my PhD, I probably had that slight crisis of confidence that many researchers have, once they've got their PhD, is, can I actually do this without my supervisor? Now I'm out on my own, what am I going to do? And I found myself thinking, well, is there something else that I'm interested in that initially was about me proving to myself I could be an independent researcher? And I found myself one day reading, so this was, I suppose, in early 2016. And I thought, well, Olympic year, the Olympic athletes is where my interest is. And I was just, I suppose, perusing the media on the internet, and there were lots of these stories that I noticed came up every 4 years about athletes talking about being low and depressed following the Olympic Games. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I wonder what research has been done on it. And as you do, you go onto Google Scholar and you have a quick search, and there's very little here. I mean, very, very little. I thought, actually, well, maybe this is something I could explore. And because I'm a qualitative researcher and I'm interested in IPA and that kind of exploration of something that hasn't been looked at in depth before, I thought, actually, this is something that really interests me. It's loosely aligned with what I already do. And it will allow me to, I suppose, progress my skills as an independent researcher. So I decided I was going to look at this and approached the third author on this paper, Dr. Mathijs Lucassen, who is a mental health researcher at the Open University. And I said, I've got this idea. I'd really appreciate you coming on board because of your expertise in mental health. And we had a very interesting conversation at that point, which I think certainly Mathijs and I have talked about since, and I think we've talked about with Holly as well more recently, is his perception was very similar to maybe the wider population. Why do you want to look at Olympic athletes? Surely they have it all. They've had this privileged opportunity to compete at the highest level. What's their problem? Why would they be experiencing mental health problems? Are there not other areas you could look at? Well, very, very quickly into our initial research, which was done in 2016, very, very quickly, he realised that actually the experiences of Olympians coming back from the Olympic Games was at least as traumatic and difficult as anything that he had researched in any of his other areas. So we did a very small scale study for Olympic athletes, female athletes, as part of that study. And this is where the link comes. Holly was one of those participants. Now, I appreciate that the participants in research are confidential and we keep them anonymous, but we're now at the point where it's open and Holly's worked on this paper, so I'm not breaking any confidences there. So I interviewed Holly on a couple of occasions for that first paper. And I suppose that developed an ongoing relationship where Holly approached me a few times to ask me a few questions relating to her dissertation. We exchanged a few emails over time. And there came a point where I thought, actually, I wonder whether Holly would like to engage in some research, because she's based down in Cardiff. And I just recently applied for a job down in Cardiff and thought it'd be great if Holly and I could work together. And got in contact with Holly, and it appeared that we almost passed each other on the motorway, because I moved from Loughborough University to Cardiff in the same 6 weeks that Holly moved from Cardiff up to Loughborough.
Wow, great timing.
However, what we decided to do at that point was to think about maybe exploring the post-Olympic blues a little bit further. And initially we were thinking about, well, is there an intervention that we can start to develop? And maybe this is something we could put in place for 2020. But as you know, research takes a lot longer than you ever anticipate it to. And one of the key elements of our ideas around designing an intervention was to get the athlete's voice. And we felt that was very important. And I suppose that was our starting point, was what do the athletes want in an intervention? And although this, I think initially was designed to be relatively minor in terms of the overall intervention, kind of grew legs of its own. And it took longer than we'd anticipated, and a number of things happened, both in terms of our own commitments, Holly's training commitments. Things took time, but we decided to set up focus groups to discuss with athletes not only what their experiences of post-Olympic blues were, but also what they wanted in this intervention. And one of the very early discussions that we had was, how do we go about this to really get their authentic, genuine opinions? And this is really where Holly came in, not only in terms of accessing participants, because anyone who's done research knows that engaging with participants, the hardest part is getting them to just engage in that first conversation about taking part. But we realised, and I think this was very much led by Holly, and maybe Holly should take over at this point, but that the athletes would be more comfortable talking to Holly than they would to either Mathijs or myself. And this is where I think the first really important thing that came out of the paper was that Holly was researcher as participant. So although she was facilitator of the focus groups, she was also an active participant. And I don't know whether that's the end of my part of the story, and I don't know whether, Dan, you'd like Holly to take over there, or whether that's just the opener. But
yeah, please.
Yeah, so for us, I think when we were chatting about how we were going to facilitate the focus groups, it was, do we think they're going to open up as much if there's, not saying that you're a random person, but if there's a randomer in the room? And I really just, being able to put myself in their shoes, I was like, potentially not. And the focus groups just went so well. It was like, they were really transparent. I was able to share my experiences of the post-Olympic blues with them. and it allowed them to open up. And I think the biggest thing for me off the back of the focus groups were that all the athletes were like, oh, thank you for that. Like, it was really great to like share. They almost use it as a forum to like share their opinions and their worries and what they experienced. And they felt like a weight lifted after sharing that. And I think that just showed us even more how important it is that there's some sort of help, support, facilitation after the games to help these athletes reduce the blues. And, we were talking about this the other day. I definitely feel like off the back of being aware of the blues and kind of doing all this research after Tokyo, I was in such a better place to deal with the blues and reduce them or not even suffer, having known about this kind of phenomenon.
So, Holly, as a researcher, as participant, correct me if I'm wrong here, you're sitting in a room with the participants and were you having a casual conversation? Was it a sort of a semi-structured interview, a fully structured interview? Did you provide your experiences first? How did that dynamic work?
It was very much, we had a semi-structured kind of interview guide that I was loosely kind of strictly sticking to, and it was starting off with some questions, what was it like going to your games, what was it like in the build up, and then we kind of got into the nitty gritty, did you experience the blues? And it was very much, I wanted to hear their opinion first, and then I would kind of interject with, totally understand how you feel, this was my experience of that, and kind of bouncing off each other. So it wasn't like we were sat around a coffee table having a really informal chat. It was more formal than that, but I think just having a friendly face, someone who could acknowledge what they were going through and relate, was just really important to having them open up.
How many participants were there, and were they across a range of sports?
Yeah, so we did 4 focus groups, and Karen said it took longer than usual because, of course, we had COVID, which meant, and I ran 3 focus groups face to face, and they were, lasting anywhere between 60 to 90 minutes. So they were really deep and sharing lots of stories. And 2 focus groups had 4 people in, and then the other 2 had 3, and it was from a range of 3 sports, 3 to 4 sports. So it was a good range of athletes with different, some people won the Olympics, some people got medals, some people didn't make the final. So it was a good range of like success level.
Team and individual sports?
All individual sports.
All individual sports. Okay, cool. And I'm guessing that you collected some themes. Some themes came through from your conversation.
Well, one of the things that we decided to do fairly early on was we acknowledged that we had 3 different perspectives. So we had an Olympic athlete, we had a sports psychologist, and we had a mental health researcher. So although we shared, I suppose, the same philosophy, our experiences were so diverse. Mathijs talks about, never doing any exercise or sport, and so it's a little bit of a running joke that he's now authored 2 papers about Olympians. So we really acknowledged that there were differences in the 3 of us. So once Holly had done the focus groups and transcribed them, for which I'm eternally grateful, individually we coded. So one of the things that tends to happen in research is whether it's the first author or the second author, it doesn't really matter who it is, but one of the researchers codes, they come up with the themes, and then there's a discussion around it. We probably took longer as well because we didn't just duplicate, we trebled the workload by all doing the coding, all coming up with our own themes and then sitting down together and going through them. We met after every focus group and talked about some of the things that had come up. So we were all familiar with what had been talked about. But it was interesting in those early discussions that although there were things that we all picked up on as being particularly interesting or distressing or concerning, we all had our own specific interests and the things that we picked up. So that kind of brought out those differences between us. And I think what that enabled at the end, although we went through a very, I'm going to say, a typical thematic analysis in terms of following the appropriate steps, we had the different perspectives in there. And it wasn't, as I imagine a lot of research is that one person does the coding, the themes, and then everybody else just does a little bit of challenging, a little bit of critical friend work, and essentially that is as it is. We really engaged the three of us to come up with these themes. They weren't easy to come up with, and in the first discussion, we'd all got slightly different things. So it was certainly the most collaborative piece of research I've ever done. So although I've worked with one or two authors before, this was really the three of us working together in a way that was enlightening, interesting, exciting, but certainly, although maybe it doesn't come out in the paper, it really was collaborative in a way that I think research really can be.
Collaborative, but from three people with different lenses of the world, completely different experiences.
Yeah, and I think that brings out the richness in the paper, that it's not biased to one perspective. I think it reflects those three lenses.
Can we unpack some of those themes?
I had like the 6 themes that we kind of agreed on in front of me. So if I just read them out, there was the Olympic dream, and then the Olympic nightmare, and then commodification, which for me, leading into this was something that I've really experienced and been passionate about. So that was really interesting that kind of came up and was very stark in all of the interviews. Then we had perceptions of social support, limited preparation, and managing and overcoming.
And I think when we look at those, Holly has already just started to focus on one of them, commodification, which really looked at the athletes as medal machines, the body as a functional object, this idea that athletes are disposable once the Olympics are over, and that kind of dehumanization. And that was certainly something that from what I understand, really resonated with Holly and some of the things that she said in the focus group. From my lens, I suppose one of the things that was particularly notable for me was this idea of the perceptions of appropriate support, and specifically the perceptions of sports psychologists. Because some of the things that the athletes some of the experiences they were talking about sports psychologists, really made me reflect on who I am and how I want to be perceived. So already there, you've got slightly different, not interest, but focus on different things that the athletes were talking about. Now, that's not to say I'm not interested in that commodification, the body as a functional object. It's certainly something that's where my journey started, looking at body image. But there were certain aspects of what the athletes were talking about that really resonated with either myself, Mathijs, or Holly. And I think that was that's really important in terms of what the research ultimately looks like.
As I was reading the paper, as a practicing sports psychologist, what I found fascinating, as lots of things I found really interesting, what I found fascinating was this notion of, as human beings, we all have an inner story, don't we? We all have a narrative that guides us from moment to moment, day to day. And playing on this notion of commodification, that it almost feels natural that the world watches the Olympics and they see machine-like performances, perhaps, but they don't always consider the human that underpins the actions that they're seeing. And so it's, even for me, as somebody who spends probably far too long thinking about the human that underpins the actions, even for me reading through this piece, where it was very powerful for me was the disparate stories, the different stories that athletes held. And with your first two themes, they're juxtaposed, aren't they? The Olympic dream, the Olympic nightmare. And with the Olympic dream, you talk about how this is an experience that people have been waiting their whole lives to do. They've had this dream narrative since they've been young. I want to go and compete in the Olympic Games. The Olympic nightmare, to a degree, being, well, when they get there, all kinds of challenges crop up, things can go wrong, and it's not always what people appreciate. And coming to you, Holly, that must be a story that's quite rife across the Olympic Games, that for years competitors have wanted to get into the Games, they've got into the Games, and suddenly, oh wow, is this it? Or it goes wrong, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's why I was so keen to do this research, was I had experienced that throughout my career, coming off the back of Rio, finishing fifth. I was really, really happy with that. And it was like nobody cared. It was, oh, you didn't win a medal, next time. Or there was a lot of that chat, and it made me feel like worthless, and just like I'd been wanting to go to the Olympics. I went to London, but you dream of it your whole life, and you get there, and it is an anticlimax, because you do feel like it ends, and then that's it. Nobody cares. Let's move on with life. And I just feel like coming into this research, I really wanted to have an impact. And, the reason why we're doing this podcast and multiple other things is we didn't just want to write a piece of research to get published. Like, we think that there's such important information in this piece of research that can help. And from the angle of raising awareness that this is how athletes feel, they feel like, a commodification, because all people care about is medals. I talked about this the other day, but I won an Olympic bronze medal, something I've worked on my whole life. And it didn't matter whether it was gold, silver or bronze for me. An Olympic medal is just the world. And someone said to me, oh, you won bronze. Oh, so close. And I just remember thinking, wow, like that needs to change. That perception that the media, the NGBs, and just the general public have of medals or nothing, or gold or nothing, going to the Olympics is insane. And it's just not celebrated. And I think part of this research is highlighting that. But part of it is, because of how athletes feel, they do suffer really bad. And like what Karen said with Mathijs is, what do Olympians have to be sad about? And I get that. I do get that. But they do, and they can have really bad depression to the point where they can't train for 2 years. And there needs to be an acknowledgement that they do suffer with it. Okay, so what are we going to put in place? And that's kind of where our passion is and what we're driving towards.
Holly, that feedback you had about your bronze medal reminds me of there was a fairly famous broadcaster who, during broadcasting, was commenting on an athlete finishing fourth and sort of suggesting, well, that's the worst place to finish. And a sports psychologist who Karen would know, but boldly put out to that broadcaster on Twitter, and probably quite rightly, well, actually there's so many circumstances here where fourth place, we can weave a completely different narrative to that might be their personal best or an incredible achievement. And as you're saying, just being in the Olympic Games, I mean, geez, that's just incredible in and of itself. And so these narratives that even broadcasters produce, there's for me, Olympians are human beings, and there's a responsibility, isn't there, from us all to try to weave these appropriate narratives. The overarching feel I had, before Karen, we come on to the sort of sports psychology support, is we need better ways in pathways to help athletes, not just support them from a performance perspective, but during the Olympics, just from a personal perspective, but post Olympics, we need to put in place practices that support them. What do you think? What came out? What can that look like to you, Holly, having been there, having done this research? What does good, strong support for Olympians look like?
Well, if I just firstly touch on what you just said, like it's the whole, oh, you're supported up to the Olympics, we're going to support you to try and win a medal. Okay, you've either have won your medal or you haven't. Everything stops. There's no support. What is that saying to our athletes? And we know winning medals is important, but at what cost? Like, at what cost to our, what kind of impact does that have on an athlete for the rest of their life? And I think that's where the problem lies, is what kind of messaging is your behaviour as the media or the national governing body showing to athletes? And I think that's why this support needs to be in place. And I think one of the really interesting parts of this research, which we didn't actually go into as great a depth in the research that was published, is we got some really good data from athletes as to what they want. We know exactly how many sessions they want, who is going to deliver it, online versus whatever. We asked those questions and they told us, so we know exactly what they want, and it's support from their peers, people that have been there, done that, got the t-shirt and know exactly what situation they're in. And whether it be a combination of a sports psychologist with the peers, that is what athletes want. And, they made it quite clear that, give us a heads up before the Olympics. Don't beat us to death with, you're going to get the post-Olympic blues, it's going to suck, just make them aware of it. And then afterwards is where the support needs to come, and it needs to be delivered by people who know what they're going through.
As I was reading it, I suppose as a sports psychologist, I'm on the one hand, I completely understand and empathise the importance of having peer-to-peer relationships and peer-to-peer psychoeducational practice, I suppose. At the same time, being a human being, the ego in me, the volume turned up and thought, come on, this is what us sports psych should be doing. But Karen, there's such, we need to understand, don't we, that actually, I mean, if anything, this is where we can potentially be involved, is actually facilitating, as Holly has alluded to there, facilitating that peer-to-peer relationship, can't we? Whether it's just as basic as upskilling ex-Olympians to be able to mentor and to help Olympians. There's a way for us to be involved.
Yeah, I think we probably underuse peer support. And I do wonder whether you're right that there are egos involved, and maybe not personal egos, but a kind of ego of a profession, that this is, if somebody else can do this, then what's our purpose? What's our role? What are we here for? And I think, if you don't mind, if I read what one of the athletes said, about the who's best suited to deliver the sessions, and it doesn't have to be a sports psych, it could be ex-athletes that understand the situation better. I've never worked with a sports psych because I don't think they understand, and they've never stood on the line and put their
bees out.
But essentially, I think what this athlete was saying was, these professionals, these sports psychologists, don't really know what it's like. So there was this real emphasis on, I want support from people who really know what it's like to go through this. Not because they've studied it, not because they've researched it, not because they've done something on post-Olympic blues, but because they really understand. Now, I think there is great potential there for peer support to be put in place that is informed by sports psychology and therefore by sports psychologists. And it's one of the things I think many sports psychologists have acknowledged over the years, that sometimes we don't need to work with the athletes, we need to work with coaches. Or we don't need to work with the athletes or the coaches, we work with higher up the national governing bodies. But whilst we're quite happy to work with coaches, I'm not familiar with many instances where the sports psychologists work with ex-athletes to provide that support. So I think there's great potential there. Now, that's not to say these Olympians, or we could call them mentors, are doing sports psychology, and therefore we have all those professional boundaries issues, but that support can be provided. And those mentors, those ex-athletes or even current athletes are supported to be able to support. And I think there is a great opportunity there for sport in general, specifically Olympic level, but sport in general, to encourage that peer support, because those are the people who can really empathise and understand.
I agree. I agree. I suppose as a sports psychologist who's been a professional sports person, I'd like to think I can have some empathy for what sports people go through. Every sports psychologist has a different background, of course. I'm thinking of, I suppose, to actually challenge the point, but also to provide an answer as well. I agree, and I think that there needs to be exactly what you said, more opportunity for peer-to-peer support. But sometimes I do wonder if I've been in a position, let's just say at a club in a sports team, where the head coach has said it would be great to get some past players to come in and talk to our players. So on a team level more so, although with the potential on a personal level as well. And then I think the thing that strikes me with a bit of fear is that you don't know what that person is going to then say, or how they're going to engage with a player. And so mentoring to me is a skill. And so to me it's making sure, again, I don't want to come across as a pompous sports psych, but it's making sure that past performers have the skills, the competencies to be able to help athletes to find their own solutions, or to suggest appropriately, rather than simply to tell somebody what to do, or to say, well, why are you doing it this way? I did it that way. That's the right way. Would be where my alarm bells cry there, I suppose.
I think there are some very interesting aspects to what you say, because if we break that down and step away from this particular experience for a moment, there are a lot of narratives that are delivered and reinforced in sport. And one of my interests is looking at autobiographies and the narratives that inevitably elite athletes disseminate through the medium of autobiographies. Now, the voices that they present, the stories that they present in autobiographies, they're not censored by sports psychologists. They're not checked by anyone for authenticity or anything like that. So athletes or elite athletes are already promoting and reinforcing cultural scripts or narratives. When we engage in sport, coaches deliver narratives, cultural scripts of how we should respond to certain things. So this is how you should respond to pressure. This is how you should respond to success. This is how you should respond to failure. And I'm using a word that as a sports psychologist I loathe, which is should, because it's all about that pressure. But it is through stories and through interaction that the narratives are created in sport. So we always have to be mindful that it doesn't matter whether it's an elite athlete coming to talk to some youngsters in sport at a talent development club, or whether it's a 15-year-old swimmer being given Michael Phelps's autobiography for Christmas and reading that. Young athletes, up-and-coming athletes, are going to be influenced by those dominant and alternative even cultural scripts, the narratives that come out in sport. So moving back towards the support that can be given by peers, as a sports psychologist, I do agree with what you've said, Dan. We've got to be very careful that you don't have an Olympian say, well, the way I got through it was through drinking and partying, and I came out of it the other end, because we don't want them necessarily to encourage or suggest those kind of avoidance strategies and anything that's detrimental. And that is why I think there's an opportunity there for collaboration, that we can. I suppose I'm going to take it, not a U-turn, but I think there's a wider context. When one of the things that we suggest, and Holly's already alluded to this, is that there is almost a two-pronged approach to this, and that athletes are primed, although not indoctrinated, primed about the post-Olympic blues. And we can do that through stories. We could do that through a podcast. We could do that through a video that's presented, maybe at the kitting out ceremony or something like that, or available online, or a podcast or something, so that athletes are aware. And those stories can come from athletes, and they can be, dare I say, edited, managed to ensure that we're getting the messages out that are supported and informed by the evidence. And then at the other end, again, we're not suggesting the only people who are going to support athletes are other Olympians, but to engage other Olympians if nothing else, because that's what the Olympians want. And we have to listen to their voices too. And that for certainly me, and I believe Holly and Mathijs as well, is that these are the athlete voices. They want support from other Olympians. And if we don't listen to that, they're going to get support from Olympians who haven't had any engagement with sports psychologists to make sure we're giving good messages. That they will get support from their friends, they will get support from their teammates, and they may engage in detrimental or avoidance coping. There is a quote. One of the participants said, "I went out for dinner with you," one of the other participants, "that night. We had a beer. We had a good chat with another friend that night, and that was my switch, my turning point. Just speaking to the right people, that makes me feel better." Now, what we don't know is what that exchange was, what support was given. So athletes are turning to their peers for support, because that is what's relatable to them. And to ignore that is to ignore not only an opportunity, but it ignores what the athletes want and what they perceive that they need. And for me, that is the main message that comes out of this paper, is that it is about the athlete's voice. And we have to acknowledge that. It's not to say it's the be-all and end-all and the only support that's given, but that it has to be an essential part of any support that we give the athletes.
So coming to you, Holly, to finish things off here, to round things up, what I'm hearing is this paper is crying out to us that athletes want holistic support. They want psychosocial support. They need that kind of support. And there's room at the table for a lot of players, essentially, a lot of characters here. That, yes, there's still room at the table for sports psychs, but we need to be a bit more industrious here. We need to understand that athletes want people who speak their language, that have trodden in their shoes, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm an athlete who is crying out for this support too, and I'm not sat here poo-pooing sports psychologists at all. I really value that. It needs to be a really delicate balance, and really this support system needs to be put in place so that it is a good balance of what the athletes want and actually support that. Sports psychologists have gone through years of training. That's not to be underestimated. And if a peer athlete is faced with a real challenge that they can't tackle, they need to have that sports psychologist on board. It's just, what is the perfect delicate balance that just, combines everything together? And I think that's kind of where we're at now, trying to work that out.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, thank you both. I mean, that's just been such an interesting hour's conversation. It's just flown by. And I know you will have sparked the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. I'm assuming you both have, well, I know you both have social media, and I think people would love to be able to engage there if you'd like to be engaged. So, Karen, if you'd like to share any kind of details, please do.
Yeah, and certainly from my perspective, I'm happy to be contacted via maybe Twitter. So it's Dr. Karen Howells, and it's at Mind4 Sport Psych. So I'm on Twitter, and that's my professional account. Or I can be contacted at work if somebody wants to engage in a slightly longer exchange. So you can look me up at Cardiff Met, and my email's easily found there on the Cardiff Met website. So I'm happy to engage, and certainly I would say if anyone wants to put a question or a discussion to the wider members of our research team, then I'm more than happy to pass that on to Matthias or Holly.
Cool. And Holly, I assume you could be followed on Twitter or Instagram or something like that?
Yeah, Twitter is Holly Bradshaw PV, and then Instagram Holly PV. I'm active on both of those, so just drop me a message.
Brilliant. Hey, well, look, thank you so much to you both. That's been a great conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting us on.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, wasn't that a brilliant conversation? I really did enjoy that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.